Pessoal, bom dia. Vamos dar início à reunião geral de hoje. Tá? Antes de começar, eu gostaria de dar alguns avisos. O nosso palestrante de hoje, o Dr. Richard Cowden, ele teve um imprevisto com o voo que atrasou, então a gente vai inverter um pouco a ordem aqui das apresentações. Então, primeiro eu vou chamar a colega que faria a apresentação, um comentário depois da fala do professor. Hoje, por conta de uma instabilidade também do sistema de conexão da USP, a gente não vai conseguir fazer a transmissão online ao vivo nesse momento, mas ela depois vai ser colocada no YouTube da mesma forma como normalmente é, tá? Então, inicialmente eu gostaria de convidar a Juliane Gonçalves, a doutora Juliane Gonçalves, ela é fisioterapeuta, ela tem pós-doutorado pela Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de São Paulo, atualmente pós-doutoranda da Faculdade de Medicina da Universidade de São Paulo, contemplada com bolsa no programa de Fixação de Jovens Doutores, uma iniciativa de parceria entre o CNPq e a FAPESP.
Bom, pessoal, bom dia a todos. É um prazer receber vocês aqui. O professor Richard daqui a pouquinho está chegando para conversar um pouquinho, né? A ideia hoje é ele trazer sobre o florescimento, acho que ele vai daí se apresentar, o Lucas também vai trazer um pouquinho sobre ele. E aí, então, a ideia, eu iria fazer alguns comentários depois do que o nosso grupo está trabalhando com florescer. Então, nós temos uma parceria com a Universidade de Harvard, que o Richard está representando aqui. Ele vai falar bastante sobre florescimento, então a gente vai fazer alguns comentários do que o nosso grupo está fazendo aqui no Brasil dentro desse tema, tá? Então, a gente vai inverter, eu vou aquecer para trazer um pouquinho. Não vai dar tempo de trazer tudo o que a gente queria, nem inicialmente. Então, em algum outro momento, depois a gente pode aprofundar alguns resultados mesmos mais específicos da pesquisa que a gente tem, tá? Na verdade, a gente começou a trabalhar com essa área, né? Então, só para contextualizar, eu trabalho como pesquisadora nessa área da a linha acadêmica de religiosidade, espiritualidade e valores desde mais ou menos 2012, junto com o professor Homero, e a gente criou um grupo onde a gente busca compreender essa dimensão espiritual religiosa e como isso impacta na nossa saúde e como a gente pode se desenvolver e ter melhores desfechos de saúde a partir de também usar essa dimensão como uma ferramenta. E aí, por conta de todo um referencial teórico que a gente encontrou do professor Tyler Vanderwill, que é um professor titular da Universidade de Harvard, que estuda florescimento, a gente foi pensando em desenvolver uma intervenção que a gente chamou de Programa Florescer, que integra, então, valores e espiritualidade na prática clínica, tá? A intenção desse programa ou dessa intervenção, ela tem uma raiz na psicologia positiva, em que a intenção é a gente desenvolver outras áreas e não a gente só focar do ponto de vista terapêutico em sintomas. Então, a proposta é ser uma terapêutica complementar em saúde, tá? Mas a gente entende pelas evidências que existem que quando a gente estimula também os lados positivos, os lados bons e fortes que nós temos, nós também trazemos saúde e promovemos melhor bem-estar assim, tá bom? Então, o que é o conceito, né, do professor? Existem vários conceitos de florescimento. O pai da psicologia positiva é o professor Martin Seligman. E existe uma pequena diferença entre o que é florescimento para o professor Seligman e o que é florescimento para o professor Vanderwill. O professor Seligman, ele tem uma visão de que florescimento, a psicologia positiva, apesar de ambos falarem sobre o bem-estar de uma forma geral, que florescimento seria um conceito de um estado de bem-estar, onde você olha para vários aspectos da vida de uma pessoa. Para o professor Seligman, essa visão ela é um pouco mais voltada para uma realização pessoal, um desenvolvimento individual. Então, acaba tendo um foco mais no bem-estar psicológico e numa realização individual realmente. O conceito de florescimento para o professor Vanderwill, ele abrange outras dimensões que não só as psicológicas, de bem-estar psicológico ou emocional, mas também acaba abarcando a questão da visão da espiritualidade, da dimensão espiritual e de contextos de florescimento coletivos. Então, a gente também vai florescer num contexto social, onde a gente está envolvido com outras pessoas e não só do ponto de vista individual. Então, acho que essa é a grande principal diferença. Existe uma amplitude na visão de florescimento do professor Vanderwill. Então, existem várias intervenções, até na literatura, né? A gente vê o pessoal trazendo bastante coisa sobre como a gente pode trabalhar a gratidão, às vezes com um exercício cognitivo ou com um exercício comportamental, e para a gente estimular a saúde. E existem algumas intervenções que eles chamam de multicomponentes. Então, você junta várias virtudes ou valores para você trazer em uma intervenção, num pacote ou num combo, esse estímulo, tá? apesar disso, nenhuma dessas intervenções de psicologia positiva, elas têm necessariamente um referencial teórico. Por que aqueles temas foram escolhidos? Por que foram selecionados aqueles assuntos, ou que se eles têm um intercâmbio necessariamente entre si? São temas mais aleatórios que a gente sabe que, isoladamente, trazem evidências na saúde e os autores reúnem. Então, por conta dessa lacuna, a gente desenvolveu daí esse programa Florescer, né, o nosso projeto de intervenção, que é baseado em virtudes e valores, e que a intenção é surgindo, né, partindo desse conceito do professor Vanderwill, a gente possa, então, estimular o florescimento de uma forma global. Não só focar nos desfechos de saúde mental, ou de bem-estar psicológico, mas que a gente pudesse também olhar para esse bem-estar, esse estado mais completo de saúde, tá? E aí, como que a gente fez isso? Então, na verdade, o que eu queria só mostrar realmente para vocês, para a gente depois até possa abrir para perguntas, a gente pode conversar, mas era exatamente como que a gente desenvolveu, então, esse protocolo, de onde que a gente surgiu com essa ideia, né? Essa figura aqui, vou até pôr pelo mouse que é mais fácil, né? Essa figura aqui é uma figura que o próprio professor Vanderwill desenvolveu, em que ele fala, dentro do conceito do florescimento, sobre os caminhos e os desfechos que a gente tem. Então, quando a gente está inserindo em comunidade, com família, no trabalho, ou educação, comunidade religiosa, a gente vive em sociedade. A gente impacta em saúde mental, saúde física, propósito, sentido de vida, caráter, virtudes, e o contrário também acontece, é uma via de mão dupla. Quando a nossa saúde também não está boa, isso também pode afetar a comunidade, o contexto onde a gente vive. E muitas vezes a gente usa de ferramentas que eles chamam de determinantes ou tópicos, para que a gente possa levar esse florescimento, essa melhora de bem-estar. Então, nós elencamos esses temas que o professor Vanderwill traz como os determinantes do florescer, para que a gente pudesse, então, criar essa intervenção. Então, são 15 temas que a gente dividiu em 12 sessões em grupo e que elas são fornecidas por profissionais de saúde, tá? A ideia é que realmente no grupo a gente possa fazer essas reflexões sobre virtudes e valores e no espelhamento a gente consiga trazer mais profundidade para que cada um consiga reolhar a sua vida e entender o que pode melhorar, o que precisa ser ajustado e realmente buscar um autocuidado, um autoconhecimento e se desenvolver em outras áreas que talvez estejam defasadas. Tudo bem até aqui? Tranquilo? Tá bom. Então, só para vocês entenderem, aqui é um exemplo de como a gente fez, então, efetivamente o protocolo. Aqueles 15 temas que nós dividimos em 12 sessões, cada sessão, eu trouxe como exemplo essa aqui, né? Atos de bondade e voluntariado. Então, cada sessão, ela tem um objetivo do que a gente quer atingir com esse tema. Então, quando a gente vai falar com os participantes sobre isso, a gente quer refletir sobre atitudes altruístas, atos de bondade, promover o engajamento de voluntariado. E aí a gente tem uma estrutura nessa sessão, né? Então a gente começa com um vídeo de uma animação de 3 minutos que tem um exemplo de um personagem vivenciando um ato de bondade e que aquilo impacta na vida dele. Então a gente vai buscando, na reflexão com os participantes, pensar sobre algum momento em que recentemente eles fizeram um ato de bondade ou receberam algum ato de bondade e como aquilo impactou na vida, como eles foram se sentindo. E aí, então, a gente vai buscando, através da reflexão, conversando para a gente, trazendo ações práticas, para a gente perceber o quanto isso pode realmente trazer uma diferença no seu dia a dia em termos de bem-estar. E aí, a ideia, então, a gente depois caminhando num segundo momento aí dessa sessão, para os itens onde a gente vai falando sobre promover o engajamento do voluntariado. Então, a intenção é desmistificar aquela questão de, olha, voluntariado tem que ser um trabalho numa zona de guerra, né, numa situação muito distante. Não, o que a gente pode fazer no nosso entorno, mas que a gente faça gentileza, a gente gere uma bondade e isso retorne também para o nosso dia a dia. A intenção é que com essas pessoas a gente consiga ir trazendo ações práticas e reflexões de como a gente pode, então, realmente mudar o nosso entorno e aí a gente perceber o reflexo disso a partir das nossas próprias atitudes, tá? Então, cada sessão ela tem uma dinâmica diferente, porque a gente foi se baseando em outros estudos para a gente poder desenvolver os temas. Então, existem sessões, a sessão, por exemplo, de perdão, a maioria dos estudos trabalha com exercício de escrita. Então, a gente tem alguns exercícios de escrita, mais a discussão em grupo. Intervenções que falam sobre felicidade, muitas vezes usam um vídeo ou uma música para estimular aquela reflexão. Então, a gente foi pegando modelos de trabalhos que já tinham alguma coisa na literatura, alguma evidência, e aí a gente construiu. Então, as dinâmicas, elas variam um pouco, elas são diferentes dentro das sessões, mas todas elas têm um objetivo, um conceito, e a gente vai conversando. Então, os temas, eles se intercambiam entre si. Tem tem um contexto onde você começa uma virtude, aí você vai falar para outra numa outra sessão, e os participantes vão resgatando aqueles temas, porque a gente entende isso num contexto global, realmente, tá? Tudo bem? Então, quando a gente pegou esse protocolo, depois que nós desenvolvemos todos os itens, a gente encaminhou para alguns especialistas que são professores acadêmicos da área de espiritualidade ou de saúde mental, bastante tempo de clínica, professores tanto acadêmicos quanto especialistas clínicos, e a gente colocou, junto com o protocolo, algumas perguntas para a gente entender coerência, clareza das sessões, será que aquilo estava apropriado para falar com pacientes com sintomas depressivos, que foi o que a gente planejou originalmente, tá? Depois que a gente mandou, então, para eles, nós tivemos, a gente chama de protocolo EDELF, é uma validação do protocolo, então a gente avalia se existe um consenso dos itens que a gente questionou para esses avaliadores, que são independentes, né? Então, foram 3 idas e vindas, onde a gente teve que reformular, inicialmente, 15% da intervenção. A gente teve que alterar alguns itens, ou eliminar, ou substituir, ou trocar, ou reescrever. Então, foram 3 idas e vindas até que a gente realmente chegou num consenso e que os avaliadores deram um ok, em que a gente se sentiu um pouco mais seguro para realmente vamos testar na prática clínica se isso funciona de uma forma efetiva. Se realmente a gente pode aplicar essa proposta com população clínica e que desfechos a gente pode encontrar, tá? Então, nós tivemos aí 2 possibilidades de... Desculpa. Nós tivemos 2 possibilidades de importar, né, introduzir essa intervenção com população com sintomas depressivos e com população com dependência química. Em que a gente falou, são estudos diferentes, são estudos pilotos, a gente chama estudos exploratórios, realmente, mas a gente queria entender, então, a execuibilidade e saber se isso realmente estaria funcionando do ponto de vista prático, tá? Os pacientes de sintoma depressivo, a gente recrutou pelas redes sociais do IPQ, num estudo quase experimental misto, então nós tivemos coleta quantitativa e coleta qualitativa, e aí o objetivo era entender o impacto dessa intervenção nos sintomas de saúde mental, qualidade de vida e nas virtudes e valores que nós coletamos, tá? A gente teve como elegibilidade, né, pontuação entre 10 a 19 pontos no PHQ-9, e indivíduos que tinham entre 18 e 59 anos, morando em São Paulo, com acesso à internet e pelo menos estudo fundamental completo, tá? Ensino fundamental completo. Essa intervenção a gente fez no período de 2021, 22, 23 e 24, então, a gente ainda pegou um período pandemia e pós-pandemia, então essa foi uma intervenção online, nós fizemos as 12 sessões semanais, com mais ou menos 90 minutos de duração cada grupo, tá? Foram recrutadas mais ou menos 2.000 pessoas, a gente introduziu, né, foram incluídos no estudo 202 indivíduos e 98 que finalizaram as sessões. Então, o que a gente encontrou para essa população, nos dados quantitativos, né, nos desfechos que a gente avaliou, foram um tamanho de efeito forte, especialmente para os sintomas de saúde mental e florescimento, moderados para a qualidade de vida, e para a grande maioria das virtudes que a gente encontrou, e fracos para religiosidade, espiritualidade e algumas outras poucas virtudes. Esses dados ainda não foram publicados, a gente não colocou tudo aqui para compartilhar, tá? Então, só para reforçar, acho que todo mundo até talvez tenha familiaridade com isso, um estudo piloto, que ele é pré e pós-intervenção, ele não tem grupo controle, e a gente tem uma tendência a ter um tamanho de efeito mais superestimado, a gente sabe que isso pode estar aparecendo um resultado talvez mais realmente superestimado do que realmente seja. A ideia é que a gente possa partir para um ensaio clínico para entender se ele tem pelo menos equivalência com alguma outra terapêutica para desfechos de saúde mental. Mas o que a gente encontrou aqui em linhas gerais foi um resultado que corroborou com outras intervenções de psicologia positiva, que também mostram desfechos de saúde mental melhor quando a gente trabalha virtudes e valores, tá? Isso não está muito distante do que a gente vê nas outras propostas. Porém, como eu falei, né, eu acho que talvez, se não ficou claro agora, acho que fica mais... A gente usou o referenciado do professor Vanderwill, então a ideia era que a gente pudesse trabalhar de uma forma global e não só focar em sintomas psicológicos ou emocionais. Então, quando a gente foi para a parte qualitativa do nosso estudo, né, que era um estudo misto, a gente conseguiu ver algumas nuances que aprofundaram um pouco esses resultados. Então, os estudos qualitativos, eles corroboraram com os dados quantitativos, né, os dados qualitativos, eles trouxeram um aprofundamento daquele resultado dos scores, em que a gente percebeu, especialmente no tema de mudanças positivas após a intervenção, temáticas que os participantes trouxeram sobre experiência de emoções positivas, aprimoramento do autocuidado, motivação para projetos e para objetivos pessoais e melhorias de funcionamento social e psicológico. E aqui a gente deixou uma fala de exemplo, né? Então, hoje é algo que eu tenho observado, que esse comportamento, essa forma de pensar, ao enfrentar desafios de questões no trabalho, que no passado me causavam sofrimento, não me causam mais. Hoje eu já consigo ter uma forma diferente de pensar, uma atitude diferente. Então, a gente percebeu bastante no discurso dos participantes essa autorresponsabilização e essa intenção de mudança. E como nós seguimos esses pacientes por 3, 6 e 9 meses, a gente teve bastante retorno nos discursos qualitativos de mudanças reais, da mudança de um emprego que não estava trazendo uma grande satisfação, mas sem uma impulsividade, com um certo planejamento, uma reinserção no mercado de trabalho e assim por diante. Então, a gente percebeu que realmente, quando a gente falou de virtudes, nesse contexto de trabalhar um tema muito próximo ao outro, a gente conseguiu oferecer essa visão de autonomia, dessas ferramentas serem usadas como uma autonomia para que a gente possa trazer melhores desfechos de saúde, tá? E a gente teve, então, a oportunidade de fazer um projeto, um estudo piloto, com população de dependentes químicos, em que a gente usou a mesma intervenção, e a gente só modificou um pouco o contexto. Então, a gente também fez um estudo exploratório misto, e aqui a gente tinha um grupo controle sem... Tirar? Bom dia. Esse daqui vai ficar um teaser para o próximo. Eu prometo que depois a gente pode aprofundar os resultados, mas eu acho que a intenção geral era apresentar para vocês que esse projeto que a gente tem desenvolvido sobre intervenções em psicologia positiva, mas especialmente do florescimento, a ideia é realmente que a gente possa trazer mudanças significativas e que a gente possa fazer, então, as pessoas realmente tocarem os seus caminhos, tá bom? Então, acho que agora a gente pode passar? Sim. Pode?
So we apologize for the delay, but unfortunately, despite of the sacrifice of our special guest, Richard Cowden, we first of all, I'd like very much to thank. We are truly grateful for him to come for it's a long journey for a very short stay. He's going to stay less than 48 hours. So, and he's going to stay much more, traveling around, sitting, than they stay here. So we are very, very much grateful, and we are very pleased that you, despite all that, you're still here, and we can have your pick up a little bit of your brain about this flourishing area. Thanks a lot. I think he's just going to present your.
So I would like to introduce Dr. Richard Cowden. He's a social personality psychologist and research scientist with the Human Flourishing Program at Harvard University and the Department of Epidemiology at Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. He contributed to numerous publications that address various aspects of human flourishing in a wide range of populations. So, Dr. Richard, if you could please come here, we're happy to have you here.
Bom dia. That's about the only Portuguese I know, so sorry. Thank you, Professor Vallada, for just making this trip a possibility, and it's wonderful to be here, and you as well, Juliane, just all the work that you put in to make this happen. So I'm glad to be here, sorry, the delays were sort of out of my hands. In any case, can you all see the slides okay? Yeah, okay. How much time do do we have now? Because I know we were supposed to start at like 10:30. Okay.
You came from so far.
Yeah. Well, what I might do is the first part that I was going to present on or take you through was kind of more of an activity, but I needed to get my myself set up online with some of the details. So because I haven't been able to do that, I might just skip that part. But maybe what we could do is just have a sort of reflective exercise anyway. So anyway, well, I'll get to that. But in any case, I would like to sort of talk to you, albeit somewhat briefly, on human flourishing, and sort of titled this Concepts, Complexities, and Insights from the Global Flourishing Study. So what I'd planned is to sort of go through a warm-up exercise. And like I said, we'll just do an adapted version of that. And then sort of talk about some considerations for measuring flourishing within and across cultures. Won't cover everything, but just some things to just consider. And then talk about a framework for conceptualizing flourishing. And then touch on some complexities when it comes to flourishing and try to conceptualize it and then even measure it. And then I thought you might be interested in reflecting on the global flourishing study, and in particularly the results that I've sort of taken a look at for Brazil. So, okay. So this, like I said, was going to be a sort of interactive exercise. Don't worry about going to this website right now. You certainly can if you want to. It's an interesting application, the Menti platform. So for future reference, if you don't know about it. But I wanted to start off with posing the question to you to reflect on, to what extent are you flourishing? And so if I had to pose that to you, and you had to rate yourself on a scale from 0 being not flourishing at all to 10 completely flourishing, where do you think you might be? So maybe I'll just give you a minute or so to just reflect on that. You can maybe write down your number or just keep it in your head. And then we'll move on to the next part. I don't know if you want to translate that into Portuguese. It's okay, yeah.
No.
Yeah, it's not going to work because he's not connected to the internet.
Yeah, but it's all right.
Yeah, yeah. Just you can reflect on your own. That was just a place where you could provide your response. The main purpose of this is for you to just reflect yourself.
The situation, I just did the exercise, and I can see the results anyway.
Oh, you can?
Anybody can do and see and just report.
Okay. All right, everybody felt like they had a good chance to reflect and rate themselves? Okay. So now there was a second part that we were going to reflect on, and we can still do this together. As you were thinking about that question, to what extent are you flourishing? A follow-up question is, what went through your mind? So what were you thinking about when you were trying to respond to that question? Does anybody want to offer their thoughts?
I was thinking about some friends and being happy.
Okay, so relationships, happiness, any others? Satisfaction with your life as a whole. Yep.
Global health.
Your global health. Yep. Of yourself. Oh, global health. Okay. Okay. Awesome. Any others over there?
Yeah.
Meaning in life,
Personalidade.
personal achievements. So the extent to which you've met goals that you've set. Well, I think that's a good sort of illustration of the point that I wanted to make. You all saw the same question: to what extent are you flourishing? But as we sort of took a snapshot of different people's thought processes, many different things can come to our minds as reference points for responding to that question. So we can focus mostly on ourselves. How is my life going? Am I happy? Am I satisfied? And I could focus on the present. How am I doing today? Or if I take my sort of general life in the current moment, how are things going? But I can take a sort of broad perspective as well and try to think about my life generally. I could think about my relationships, my work, my studies, my spiritual life, and try to sort of hold that all together in terms of trying to make my response. Or I could just focus on specific dimensions, right? So maybe if work is a priority for me, that could be something that I just strictly focus on as a reference point. I could also think about the future. So things like optimism about the future of one's life. The gentleman over there talked about meeting one's goals. You could also think about, well, am I on a trajectory to meet future goals that I have? And so that could be factored into how one thinks about responding to that question. We could also factor in how other people are doing. If you have a family member who's ill, you might say, well, I'm not flourishing as much as I perhaps could be because my close relative is not doing so well. And then we could factor in how one's community is doing, or how Brazil is doing. The reference there to global health. How are we doing as a planet in terms of whatever it might be? And that could shape your response, or at least how you think about responding. So I use that as a sort of example of some of the work that we've been doing in the Global Flourishing study in the lead up to administering the first wave of the survey that we've been using. And really the main point that I want to make is that people within cultures, so people within Brazil as one example, but also people across cultures, they interpret, make sense of survey items differently, or at least they can. And so what I want to talk about briefly is a case example using some data from the Global Flourishing study, sort of survey development process. So I'll talk more about the Global Flourishing study later on, but basically the first wave of data was collected for that study in 22 to 23. But prior to that survey being launched, there were a bunch of steps that took place to make sure the survey was capturing the most salient indicators of flourishing across different cultures. And so the preliminary version of that survey was pilot tested, and one part of that was conducting cognitive interviews. So trying to see how people make sense of these questions. The cognitive interviews were split into two forms. There was a Form A and a Form B. And across those two forms, we had about 10 people in each country participate, except in places like India, where there were 20 people who participated. But that was split across these two forms. So the one form, we focused on responses to one of those forms. So 116 individuals, so about 5 from each country, 10 from India. And then we try to make sense of how people interpreted they made sense of certain survey questions. You should hopefully be able to see these citations, but if I need to send them afterwards, I can as well. So this is just a snapshot of the questions that we focused on. We focused on 5 of the items in the preliminary Global Flourishing Study survey. The items differed across the 2 forms that I mentioned, and this is not exhaustive of all the items that were tested, but with 116 participants with open-ended responses, it was quite a lot to go through. But we took items that sort of were representative of different aspects of well-being. So life worthwhile, that question deals with sort of meaning in life. Giving up happiness, that's the sort of delayed gratification aspect of character value. But essentially what happened was interviewers went through the survey, administering these questions one by one, and then after each question, they had a follow-up question. You can see at the bottom, in your own words, what is this question asking? And we didn't use their actual responses to the survey item. We just focused on analyzing their responses to that follow-up question, which you might call a comprehension probe. So this is just a snapshot of one of the main tables in this paper. I think it's really interesting to go to this table and look at all 22 countries. Here I've just sort of pulled out Brazil, Argentina as 2 sort of comparisons with the sort of global themes that were produced. But basically what we did was we used the constant comparative sort of qualitative method. First, looking within a particular country to identify common codes, what emerged as common across these individuals within Brazil, and at a very basic sort of code level. And so there was a bit more granularity there. And then we elevated those to the next level, which we call categories. So if you look in Brazil, that blue box above codes is categories. So this is further trying to sort of condense down these codes into higher order themes. And then we took this a step further. We took those categories and tried to identify common themes that applied across the countries. And so in doing this, you can basically get a sense of what's common across these countries, what's the essence of comprehension for a particular item, and what varies across countries, perhaps, and also what might vary within countries. So let's take the first item as an example. So let's go back for a second. Overall, to what extent do you feel the things you do in your life are worthwhile? 0 being not at all worthwhile, 10 being completely worthwhile. And if we look, the responses to that comprehension probe are in the far left there. You can see the codes for Brazil. There's a few of them. Some people reference a sort of process. Some people reference their work, profession. Some people talked about what makes you happy. And so you can see some variability there, even just with 5 individuals in Brazil. And then you can even look, sort of compare Argentina to Brazil, and you can do that with codes or categories. But if you look at categories, Argentina, the key sort of category there is pursuing or doing something important, which in Brazil was slightly different. It's navigating the process, or happiness in the process of doing something. And so you can see sort of connections between those, but different ways of describing that. And then when we elevate across these countries, the common theme is finding meaning in the process. So again, I won't go into all of these, but hopefully that gives you a good example of what I was talking about. Sort of people within and across different countries might interpret and make sense of different survey questions differently. why is this important? Well, for different reasons, but I would sort of encourage you to just keep this in mind as we go through the rest of this kind of talk. So some things to just keep in mind in terms of those results, they're not perfect. So there are small samples in most of those countries. There is also sample variation. So they try to recruit participants that were going to be somewhat representative of the samples that were going to be included in the Global Flourishing Study, which are meant to be nationally representative. And so you can imagine that different countries, they vary in their demographic makeup. So in some countries, the participants in this sample were more educated. Some countries were less educated, older, younger, things like that. And then there's also a sort of language kinds of issues that we should sort of keep in mind. So some words are difficult to translate into other languages. There may not be an equivalent. I think there's an equivalent for flourishing. Am I right? But other kinds of terms, perhaps not. And then in languages differ in sort of the order of words and sentences. So differences in the order of subject, verb, and object. And this can affect things like primacy and recency effects. And then one other thing is that there are, at least in these data, the interviews were done by different people in these different countries. So there could be sort of interviewer effects or biases. Okay, so I deliberately didn't start with this because I wanted to do the reflective exercise that we went through. But we could just sort of take a step back maybe and say, well, how do we conceptualize flourishing? Now, this is not a monopoly conceptualization. So I want to sort of make that clear. There's different ways that people might conceptualize, even measure flourishing. This is just one approach, and we can certainly debate aspects of it. But our program sort of uses a working definition of the relative attainment of a state in which all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives. The spiral staircase is meant to sort of illustrate that we perhaps may never fully flourish. This is an ideal state. This is a direction that we're sort of headed to, but you could pose the question: are we ever fully flourishing? And particularly in some philosophical and religious traditions, the answer to that, in terms of this side of eternity, would be no. Flourishing is only possible, say, in the afterlife or other ways of thinking about it. Okay, so what do we mean by all aspects of a person's life are good, including the context in which that person lives? We can break it down into two pieces, perhaps. One is the health and well-being of the individual. So that's the quality of a person's personal objective and subjective state across physical, mental, social, and spiritual dimensions of existence. By objective and subjective, we can sort of break apart those dimensions into those two pieces. So you can imagine a person who's dealing with a chronic illness that may be somewhat debilitating, but if they're able to manage it well enough through, say, medication or taking care of their body as best they can, diet, things like that, they might say, well, my perception of my health is actually quite good. I feel quite good in my body. So those can come apart. And the inverse is true as well, right? You could take a young person who is very healthy from an objective perspective, but they may not feel very well, and so they may rate their physical health as not very good. We can also flourish in certain ways and not others. So I might be physically well, mentally strong, have good relationships, but maybe I'm neglecting my spiritual life, and so that could be some area for growth, perhaps. So just but that doesn't mean that, just because I'm not flourishing in one area, I'm not flourishing at all. There may be some flourishing that's possible. The second aspect of that part of that definition is that flourishing is systemic. It is contextualized. It happens within an environment, the environments in which we live and go about our daily lives. And so this is really kind of referring to the quality of those contexts. And the essence of this is that, your own health and well-being is really only sustained and supported in the context of healthy communities. And you could pose a question this way: can a person fully flourish if the environment and communities in which they are embedded are not doing well? You might say, again, some flourishing is possible, but sort of the optimal flourishing, the ideal state, maybe is not entirely possible. And here's some examples: might be sort of displaced communities or violent neighborhoods where it's not safe. The individual might be doing well, but there might be aspects of their community or neighborhood that's sort of holding them back, if you will. But the flip side, there might also be aspects to these more adverse kinds of environments that provide the sort of fertile ground for growth in certain aspects of flourishing. So I don't want to advocate for adverse environments, but adversity is often sort of the way in which we grow in character, things like that. So there is there's a sort of paradox there. But if you take those two sort of pieces, complete flourishing is essentially a situation in which both the person and the context in which they are living are doing well. That would be sort of the optimal case for sort of for full flourishing. Okay. So now what I would like to sort of go through is zoom in a little bit more. Again, not going too deep or spending too much time on this, but just to give you a snapshot that, we can go sort of to an increasingly deeper level of granularity when we think about flourishing and well-being. So if we go back to the first point I made about the health and well-being of the individual, you can think about well-being as multidimensional. It isn't just one thing. And again, as I sort of alluded to earlier, this is not a sort of monopoly conceptualization. There's different ways that you can carve up this conceptual space in terms of what the dimensions of well-being might be. So this table here is from a paper that will be coming out on April 30th. And that paper actually provides a snapshot of flourishing in all 22 countries in the Global Flourishing Study. And this table is embedded within that. So one way that we can break it up is physical well-being, emotional well-being, cognitive well-being, volitional well-being, social well-being, material well-being, and spiritual well-being. And later on, when I present some Global Flourishing Study results, I'll show a sort of different schema. But the second column has representative examples. Representative because within those specific domains, there's a multidimensionality to them as well. So as one example, we can zoom in on emotional well-being and think about things like positive versus negative affect as sort of two aspects. Or we could think about varieties of happiness, which I will go into a little bit more here as a sort of illustration of the depth that we can go into even within these specific domains. So taking that idea of sort of varieties of happiness further, Tim Lomas and Tyler Vanderwill at our program, they recently put forward a taxonomy of happiness that looks at 16 different dimensions or forms of happiness. What I've sort of put up here is a figure of just 5 of those, no, 6 of those, sorry, as just an illustration that even happiness itself can be multidimensional, can have different sort of flavors to it. So as one example, in terms of how they're defining happiness, a hedonic sort of definition is that happiness is a mental state of quality in relation to one's present emotions and feelings. That's the typical conception of happiness, at least in the West. But you can also have a chironic kind of happiness, which is more about sort of the quality of one's mental state in relation to some kind of spiritual or transcendent reality. And again, just 2 examples of the 6 that are here, and then there's 10 others that they put forward. So I'll come back to some bigger picture thoughts about this kind of multidimensionality in a moment. One thing that I did want to kind of touch on that I think is relevant when thinking about flourishing is the topic of suffering, and it's probably highly relevant in a medical context. So how do we deal with these kinds of concepts that in many philosophical and religious traditions are sort of paradoxical, right? If we take out working definition that we use at our program as an undesired experiential state of considerable duration or intensity involving the loss or privation of a perceived good, flourishing has a sort of, suffering has a negative connotation, right? It's unpleasant. We're averse to it. But yet in some of these traditions, suffering is seen as necessary for growth. And I put up one piece of scripture from the Christian tradition that sort of epitomizes this, right? Rejoicing in your suffering. That seems quite extreme, right? And in some recent work, we try to dive into this a little bit more. I have a quote there from a recent paper. Suffering can serve an adaptive or facilitative function by pointing us to areas of our lives in need of change or providing us with an opportunity to grow in new ways. So suffering may negatively impact our lives in some ways, but it may also be the fertile ground that we perhaps need for spiritual or personal growth. And so you can reflect on this question, is a rating of moderate or high suffering necessarily bad? Now, there's all sorts of contextual considerations to that. But I would say no to that question. Particularly if you take a longer perspective on somebody's experience, oftentimes suffering does lead to positive kinds of changes or insights, but they often take time to unfold. So building on this kind of idea, we've done some work trying to think more about how do we help people engage or encounter suffering in a way that might increase the possibility of some kind of use coming from it or some kind of growth. And one aspect of this, there's many ways that we can dive into this, but one aspect that we've explored so far is the idea of a mindset about suffering. And we in this one paper cited down below there, we talk about the distinction between a debilitative mindset about suffering and a facilitative mindset about suffering. With the latter being a fundamental belief that suffering has constructive and ennobling consequences, that ultimately suffering has some purpose, has some utility for my life. On the other end of the spectrum, the debilitative end would be a sort of belief that suffering has no value and it's only making my life worse. But we use this kind of idea to talk about, to propose three things. One is that if somebody has a facilitative mindset about suffering, they believe that suffering has some ultimate value that can, say, add meaning to their lives, their threshold for experiencing suffering will be higher, at least in theory. So if you take two people with identical situations, the person with a greater facilitative mindset, they are less prone to endorsing suffering when they experience something that might ordinarily bring about suffering. The second proposition is that a facilitative mindset puts somebody in a position to be more inclined to respond adaptively to their suffering. So one example might be seeking some kind of transformation through their experience. And then the third proposition is we might anticipate that the effects of suffering on a person's well-being might be lower among those who have more of a facilitative mindset. Now, those are early propositions. They're based on some relevant evidence from the social sciences, but also draw on some philosophical and theological ideas. But those still need to be tested more extensively. But what we have done is we've taken those ideas one step further, and we recently finished creating a workbook, a do-it-yourself workbook for suffering that deals with this idea about a mindset about suffering. And part of the goal here is to make resources that sort of engage suffering with an orientation towards growth, freely available, publicly available, and sort of can be used in multiple contexts. So this is now available online, for example, and anybody can go ahead and download it. It can be given as a supplement to, say, patients in treatment, depending if the clinician feels that it's potentially useful. And we found in the preliminary work that we've done that people do find this kind of resource to be helpful. Okay, so sort of bringing the complexities together from sort of thinking about the framework that I talked about right through to the issues with suffering. You can see that the conceptual terrain and granularity when thinking about flourishing are challenges to research on flourishing, especially when you think about trying to do this kind of work cross-culturally. What is truly universal across cultures, and what is more particular to specific cultures? How do we measure in a suitable way, in the most appropriate way across different languages and cultures? I talked about some of the preliminary work that was done in the lead up to the survey for the Global Flourishing Study. So many steps were taken to try to ensure that measurement was done well across these different cultures, but it's still imperfect. I think it's difficult to reach a level of perfection. Other questions like, what do we measure? Do we measure things like hedonic happiness? So try to capture things that we usually measure, say in the West, or do we try to get at things like chironic happiness that might be less pervasive in certain cultures, more pervasive in others? What's the best way to measure these things? Are there suitable tools out there for them, for measuring certain concepts? And then, as I mentioned sort of early on, how should we interpret responses to measures of well-being in different cultures? So those are pretty big questions, but I posed as a sort of maybe reflective questions for you, and these are still ongoing issues that still need to be addressed. So there's lots of work to be done in the realm of flourishing. Okay. Now I think maybe for the fun part for you all, hopefully, talking about the global flourishing study, but trying to touch on what we've seen so far in Brazil. None of this is published yet. Some of it will be, but it is very sort of high level. But I'd be interested to get your thoughts because you live here and you can make better sense of the results than probably I could. Okay, so I have sort of talked about the global flourishing study in little bits, but the idea with the global flourishing study is to do a longitudinal panel study in a diverse group of countries around the world, in terms of language, culture, etc. And wave one was completed. Like I said, it differed by country, but mostly in 2023, some data collection in 2022. And that baseline sample has more than 200,000 people with roughly nationally representative samples in each country. And together, they represent roughly half the world's population. And so for Brazil, there are about 13,000 participants, and you can see it up there. So quite a high proportion of the respondents come from Brazil relative to other countries. The survey is quite broad. It covers, I think the survey has 109 items in total, and most constructs are measured with single items. So not a whole lot of depth in terms of measurement, but lots of breadth. And so I won't list all of them. I have a slide later on showing you the constructs that are assessed, but many different aspects of well-being and related kinds of factors are assessed. Oh, there's that slide. So it's kind of small, but here we have 61 indicators of well-being and sort of related kinds of factors, and broken down into 8 dimensions or domains. Again, remember I sort of mentioned earlier, we can carve up the space in different ways. We could debate whether certain constructs fit better in some categories than others. So this is just one kind of way of mapping things out. And you can see, if you're interested, you can go and look at the specific wording of these items. You just type in Global Flourishing Study Codebook, and it should take you right there. So as I mentioned, most of those indicators were assessed with single items. The rating scales varied. So for constructs that had a 7-point scale or more, we estimated means for those. For constructs that had less than 7 categories, we essentially produced a binary dichotomization of that outcome. So we estimate proportions of those particular indicators. Okay. So what I did here was I looked at the means and proportions for Brazil, contrasted with the pooled means proportions for all 22 countries combined. And so they were pooled meta-analytically. So the means and proportions were estimated in each country and then brought together. And then what I did was I looked at whether the 95% confidence intervals for those means or proportions overlapped or didn't. And if they didn't overlap, I made a tentative conclusion that Brazil and compared to all 22 countries combined was substantially different. And then if they were different, they didn't overlap, then I said, well, is Brazil doing better or is it doing worse, more or less favorably compared to all 22 countries combined? And so I've broken it here into those 8 domains I showed you on the previous slide. Here it is, yep. And the green represents, indicators when the 95% confidence intervals didn't overlap and Brazil was doing more favorably, and the orange indicates where the inverse was true. So the general picture, as you can probably see, is that Brazil is has a sort of some strengths in psychological well-being, and I'll go into more detail about some of those in a moment. Less strongly on psychological and social distress, and also social well-being, character and pro-social behaviors. Brazil is also doing quite favorably there. That's an area of strength. And then religion and spirituality is a little bit difficult because difficult to talk about in terms of more or less favorable, because some of the indicators are about beliefs, for example, like the extent to which you believe in God. So it's hard to really talk about that as more or less favorable, depending on your view. But scores were generally in the better direction for Brazil on many of the religion and spirituality indicators. And some challenges, I think, in terms of socioeconomic factors. So anyway, this is a very broad overview, but I think it's quite interesting to look at the areas of relative strength and weaknesses in Brazil compared to the other countries combined. And I've just totaled those numbers for the kind of more core well-being domains. So those 6 that have a blue box around them. And you see Brazil doing more favorably on 10, less favorably on 10. And there were about 22 where the confidence intervals just were overlapping. So no clear sense of a difference. Okay, so if we go one step deeper, you can look at the means of proportions in each country relative to one another, and just crudely rank them. So that's what I did here, and then I looked at. So that was across all 61 of those indicators, including the religion and spirituality ones. And then I said, well, on which indicators is Brazil ranked within the top 5? And you can see this is future life evaluation, so and optimism. So these are psychological well-being indicators. So lots of positive thoughts about the future. An orientation to promote good. So doing rating oneself as trying to do good in all different kinds of situations. A sense of hope for the future. Gratitude, being thankful, and helping others. And so those are all indicators of character, pro-social behavior, and that sort of maps onto what I was alluding to on the previous slide at a very broad level. And then you can also look at, well, where is Brazil ranking in the bottom 5 on certain indicators? And these align with a lot of what I shared on the previous slide. So less strongly on some of the social well-being, social distress, and psychological distress indicators, and then financial stability and material stability. Those were the the areas of potential growth there. And those indicators are sort of, they assess perceived worry about financial security, material security, not so much sort of objective circumstances. There are those indicators in there like employment, income, but that isn't what seems to differentiate Brazil from most of the other countries. And then, one other indicator there that I didn't touch on the previous slide is pain. So quite a high level of pain, suffering, traumatic distress. This is being bothered by traumatic events that have happened in a person's life. And so I think those are quite striking areas of potential growth, I think, for Brazil. Okay. One other thing I thought might be interesting to just touch on, and I will give some of the caveats to all of this next, but there's 3 countries from South America in the Global Flourishing Study, Brazil, Argentina, and Mexico. And so we can just take a look at how they might differ. This is a kind of crude comparison, so don't overinterpret some of this, but if you compare to, basically what I did was I looked at which indicators do they differ by approximately 10 ranking spots when they were ranked from 1 to 22. And so compared to Mexico, Brazil was doing worse on this Wave 1 survey in terms of sense of balance in life, sense of mastery, the quality of social relationships, social support, government approval, political voice, city satisfaction, anxiety symptoms, suffering, loneliness, pain. So some of those were already reflected on the previous slide. But some interesting ones like political voice, government approval, these are sort of political engagement kinds of statements. And then compared to Argentina, just a few differences there. Mastery, social support, and employment. And so mastery and social support were the 2 commonalities, really. But generally speaking, if you want to make a crude comparison, Mexico seems to be doing slightly superior to Brazil relative to, say, Argentina. And I didn't find any instances where Brazil was doing better than Mexico or Argentina. Again, with some of these caveats in mind here. So as I mentioned, most of these constructs are assessed with just one item. So we have to be careful about overinterpreting responses to these. And then furthermore, lots of these indicators were analyzed as dichotomous variables. And so we've basically truncated the variability in them. There's also effects of translation, language, cultural differences. Brazil, that survey was completed in Portuguese. Mexico and Argentina would have completed in Spanish. And so some of the challenges I mentioned early on about language and translation certainly apply here, perhaps. There's variation in timing of data collection. So I don't recall exactly when Mexico, for example, collected data. You can find that information in that study here, but that could factor into differences based on contextual kinds of things that are happening in certain countries. As one example, seasonality effects, perhaps not when comparing South American countries, but when comparing, to other parts of the world. Sampling variability, each country differed in the samples that they collected. So in some countries, the sample was not entirely a probability sample. In Brazil, it was a combination of probability and non-probability sample. And in Brazil, a higher proportion of participants came from a non-probability sample. So even though the data are weighted to be nationally representative, it's still an approximation for that reason. As I mentioned, the rankings that I talked about are somewhat crude, but I think are very interesting still to think about. And then, as I touched on also, there may be gaps in the cultural specificity of the GFS survey. There might be something that's particularly salient to flourishing in the context of Brazil that is not captured in this survey. So I think all of these things are important to keep in mind. Okay, well that's all I had for you. I don't know how I'm doing for time, but anyway, yeah, I welcome all thoughts and questions. I don't know if I'll be able to answer all of them, but anyway, we can open it up for some discussion.
So some technical issues. Thank you, Dr. Cowden, for the brilliant lecture. I certainly think that put a lot of thoughts in our minds. Quite interesting. So we have some time. I don't know if anyone has any question and would like to ask. Let me see. Oh.
Thank you, Dr. Cowden. I'm Homero Vallada. I'm a cardiologist, so I'm not a psychiatrist. So I have two questions / comment. The first one is how to adapt that not only to mental health, but in a more comprehensive definition that takes into account considering physical, emotional or mental, spiritual, and also social. So that's the construct that as a cardiologist, I'd like to see for my patients. My second question is about the definition. We do have a department in the Brazilian Cardiology Society of Spirituality and Cardiovascular Medicine. And we construct the definition based on several international definitions for spirituality. How would you compare flourishing with the spirituality definition for research purpose? Spirituality and flourishing. And the third one is regarding the external validity. So we are participate for almost 16 years of a prospective cohort study. I believe that you know the PURE study with McMaster University, 200,000 people. And we are still facing and struggling with the representativeness of the country. So it's quite hard to discuss the blood pressure, the Brazilian mean blood pressure, the Brazilian mean cholesterol. And for those questions, it's even harder to say that's the Brazilian photograph of the mental or spiritual health. So how would you suggest to deal with this already known limitation, but of course, always informative, but not conclusive, maybe a bit more. And sorry for too many questions. Thank you.
Well, maybe I'll start with the last one there. I mean, at the end of the day, we're always going to have limitations, right, of this kind of work. And there's trade-offs, right? Like the cost of getting the most optimal probability sample is quite high. So I think one way we can do this is like triangulation, multiple kinds of studies, right, where we're putting multiple sources of evidence together, right? This is why like it's helpful to do a kind of a meta-analysis, for example, rather than like relying on one single study to form some conclusion. I think the other way, at least one way we're thinking about the global flourishing study is sort of like a step forward, in terms of doing large scale panel research, panel studies. The Gallup World Poll, has been going for many years, and they cover many countries. Could even be most of the world's countries, but they don't collect longitudinal data. So. And so there's essentially some learning that's happening here too that I think will be helpful for the next iteration of work. Some of the ranks or comparisons that I just shared, like for Brazil, like I think what would be helpful now is to say, well, like, do those observations hold true, like on the ground, like based on other data that you might have collected? I come originally from South Africa, where there are a lot of social structural kinds of vulnerabilities that are also prevalent here in Brazil. You see a lot of these similar kinds of trends, like lots of socioeconomic kinds of challenges, but lots of religious, spiritual engagement. And so we can even look at countries that are kind of similar in their socio-cultural kind of makeup and see whether our findings are sort of coalescing across those countries. So anyway, I guess the summary is sort of like stepping stones, maybe, like we would like to make definitive conclusions, right, about these trends, but what I just shared, at least in terms of Brazil, is just one data point, one snapshot. And I think your other question was about sort of integrating spirituality into flourishing, the definition. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, there are lots of, like, we've had lots of conversations in our program about the extent to which you do try to integrate or accentuate spirituality within the definition. I think that definition, if I can go back to it. Oh, there you go. That accommodates a person's spiritual life. Thinking about all aspects of a person's life being good. And if we assume, if one takes the assumption that the spiritual dimension is fundamentally important, then you would integrate that into that definition, if that makes sense. So this definition is broad, sort of on purpose, in that it can be used in multiple different kinds of contexts. But if you were going to, I think, try to accentuate one aspect of, like, if you contrast, say, physical, mental, social, and spiritual, right? If you wanted to accentuate the spiritual dimension in the definition, I don't know if that's what you're asking, but that's an interesting thought, and I haven't thought about how you might do that. It'd probably have to be a much more specific definition than this one. But it's interesting to think about going into that territory. Is that the kind of lens that you're applying in your work, like working with patients, like prioritizing the spiritual?
Yeah, sorry.
We are still struggling how to define health in a more comprehensive way for patients. And over the last months, we thought this is just ongoing definition, and we're just preparing the manuscript for that. We are just suggesting that our purpose for our patients should be to improve life expectancy plus reducing number of relevant events, cancer, cardiovascular events, plus improve cognitive impairment and spirituality-based outcomes. Because otherwise, what is the point to live longer if you don't prevent dementia, if you don't have those benefits for the health? And why we came out with this definition. I thought, if I am a patient, what I'd like to have from my doctor. So that's why I believe that we must have a comprehensive definition, taking into account spirituality plus what we already know in several areas of medicine. But that's just a concept.
Yeah.
We need to work on that.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting because as soon as you specify that, right, it's at least in a clinical realm, then you need expertise, right, to be able to support that, right? So that opens up other kinds of challenges, right? But yeah, I think it's Tyler makes this point of I think what you're alluding to is just the potential problem of just neglecting religion, spirituality altogether, right? And possibly finding ways to draw upon that when it's potentially meaningful to the patient, you know. Yeah.
Richard, thank you very much for your clear presentation with interesting data from Brazil and showing the complexity of the human flourishing. I actually, it's not a question. I just would like to raise the importance that this theme is becoming all over the world very important for health and managing and making people aware for many different aspects of life. One thing that, of course, is just a small part and usually relate with the Gallup surveys around the world is what The Economist just published recently, 2 weeks ago or less. This kind of what is the happiest country in the world? So, and the list is interesting. That is always the Scandinavian countries. The 4 first is like Finland is always apparently every year, and after is Denmark, Iceland, and Sweden. So it's just to show that the people are more and more interested in broader perspective and try to understand human life and what is important and how is the way to live.
Yep.
So it's not actually a question, it's just raising the importance of the subject.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. Yeah. And I think this is one of the sort of steps that this global flourishing study is trying to take, right, is to say, well, you know, let's broaden the scope of what we're focusing on and try to kind of just paint a more complete picture of people's lives. So rather than just thinking about you know, say happiness, right? Can we think about the functioning of a person as a whole, right? Across different aspects of life. And yeah, I think, you know, lots of this work is kind of new, just the way it's unfolding. And so there'll be lots to learn and then use for what comes next, you know.
So I think we have enough time for one more quick question. Anyone?
Hi, Richard. Thank you for the presentation, for showing us the complexities of the framework of flourishing. I was just wondering if we have this idea of kind of flourishing in different aspects. You can flourish in different aspects, not necessarily fully flourishing, as you mentioned. And we have this difference in regarding the context, the culture in the countries we have, in the cultures we have. How would you advise us when we have empirical data, for instance, in Brazil, when you're studying flourishing among the population, when you're collecting data with a specific sample, how would you advise us to navigate through the results we have? Should we compare this with other countries that are similar, if we can assume something like this? Should we just compare to other Brazilian population? Can we compare to American flourishing individuals flourishing in America, for instance? How do you think we can approach this, since we have all these differences regarding the aspects of flourishing for each culture, different culture?
Yeah, I mean, I would say personally, I think you can make different kinds of comparisons, holding these caveats and limitations in mind. So as long as one's not overextending the data, like it's interesting to say, well, how is Brazil doing compared to the US, right? Again, holding all these caveats in mind, and then trying to find other kind of sources of data to unpack the nuances a bit more, you know. So yeah, so it is a bit complicated. It also depends on the quality of the data as well, you know. Yeah, you know, for example, you wouldn't want to really compare like a nationally representative US sample to say like a student sample in Brazil, right? So but yeah, I think what we've at least in some of the papers that are coming out now, what we've tried to or at least what a few of us have tried to do is sort of point out some of the distinctions without necessarily doing a compare and contrast and speculating too much about why they might be different, or pointing out, you know, this country is top of the list and this one's the lowest, you know. Yeah, so but there are certainly challenges with that. Like it's not I think you have to be careful with the wording and language choices that we use to kind of write up these kinds of results when there are these multiple countries involved, and yeah.
So I would like to once again thank you so much for the brilliant lecture and coming here to our grand rounds. So in the name of the psychiatry department of our institute, thank you so much, Dr. Cowden.
Thank you. Yeah.